This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now.
For thousands of years, people have used all sorts of weapons: spears, rocks, knives, and in the last few centuries, guns. In the past few decades, guns have been a source of heated debate, with discussions revolving around their significance in racial, socioeconomic, and constitutional issues across the United States. In this premiere feature film, we will be examining how one 2008 Supreme Court case about gun rights, District of Columbia v. Heller, marked a turning point in gun use and laws in the United States, utilizing geographical, political, and psychological science perspectives to fully understand this particular Supreme Court case and the nature of gun laws, uses, and its users across America and across the world. The whole case started after a police officer named Dick Heller was denied a license to keep a handgun in his home in District of Columbia. DC had been known at the time to have some of the strictest gun laws in the country. Before this case was brought into court, there was a lot of confusion about how to correctly interpret the Second Amendment and how to apply that interpretation into law. The Second Amendment states, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed." Seems pretty simple, right? Everyone in the US gets to have guns, and nobody can do anything to take away their right. Right? Wrong. Because of commas in the amendment, both the Supreme Courts and the state courts were previously unable to reach a consensus on an agreed interpretation of the passage regarding the militia versus individual rights. In the Sotomayor confirmation hearings of 2009, Representative Coburn testified to his anger over this, saying, "The Second Amendment, which is spelled out in the Constitution, is not settled law and settled fixed." Deeper into this, the actual workings over the debate versus the two interpretations of rights were heavily based on wording. One example of this is in the DC vs. Columbia oral arguments, where Walter Dellinger says, "Well, it makes no sense for Miller to require the arm to be militia-related if the right is not," and the key phrase is "bear arms." Do people only legally bear arms if they were associated with a militia? Or should they be able to legally bear arms as individuals, untied to a militia? These questions, which the Supreme Court answered, were what made the case so controversial and a turning point in gun use and gun laws in the US. In fact, the case of DC vs. Heller in 2008 was the first time the Supreme Court decided on the meaning of the Second Amendment in over 70 years. Through a geographic lens, we can better understand gun use and gun laws and how they were impacted by this case. First, let's compare rural and urban parts of the US. In a 2017 survey run by the Pew Research Center, they found that 58% of rural Americans have at least one gun in their house, compared to only 29% of urban Americans. This is a significant difference, with twice as many rural households having guns in the home than urban households. The survey found that states which have the largest amounts of rural counties, southern states, have had the largest amounts of firearm-related deaths in recent years. In contrast, states with the greatest amount of urban counties, northern states like Illinois, Wisconsin, and New York, were found to have fewer gun-related deaths. This is due to northern states having tighter gun control laws than others, which makes sense, right? Guns in southern states are often used for common rural practices like hunting and firearm sports, which makes the southern state legislators less inclined to impose strict gun laws because it's a prevalent part of many rural people's culture. On top of this, states with the highest rates of gun ownership, southern states, have had the highest number of suicides. Now let's consider America's gun use and laws on a global geographical scale. The US has 4.4% of Earth's population, but 42% of the total amount of civilian-owned guns on Earth. Just think about that for a second. One country has almost half the world's guns, and there are hundreds of countries. Going along with this, the US has had many more firearm homicides than most countries, for example, over 16 times more than Germany. Through these facts, we can determine that on the national scale, guns are used for many different reasons, but have different impacts on different types of communities, which is why it's so hard to make laws around them. On a global scale, America has more guns than most countries and more gun-related deaths than most countries, and a lot of people have realized this fact. Here, take a look at this graph created using data from the CDC's database. It clearly shows a connection between gun deaths with higher rates of gun ownership. Politics play a huge part in gun use and gun laws, and it's important to fully understand them in order to see why this case marked a turning point in them. Outside of District of Columbia vs. Heller, gun lobbyist groups like the NRA have had big power in political decisions regarding gun control because of money, lawyers, and millions of members at their disposal. Along with their influence, racial biases often associated with perceived reasonings behind mass shootings, an example, radical Islamic terrorism, are associated with both the formation and limitation of gun control measures. In fact, 79% of Republican voters believed that the San Bernardino shooting was caused by radical Islamic terrorism, while 60% of Democrats saw the shooting as an event of domestic gun violence. The point is, support for gun control laws often sparks up significantly right after mass shootings, and because there have been so many recently, it has helped the ongoing expansion of gun rights in the US. Because of gun lobbyists and the NRA, Republicans were able to take control of both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court. This contributed to the ruling in D.C. vs. Heller because the court ruled in the conservative decision aligning with gun advocates rather than the gun control advocates. Conservatives and pro-gun activists argued that citizens of D.C. should be constitutionally protected to own a handgun because of a common use at the time, self-defense. Justice Scalia discusses this in the opinion of the court of D.C. vs. Heller when he says, "We also recognize another important limitation on the right to keep and carry arms, fairly supported by the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. If the weapons are most useful in military service, they may be banned." This shows that the court associated handguns as an acceptable weapon for self-defense, and because of this, it was legal. On the other side, those who were liberal-leaning argued that there was no just need for civilian use of handguns in present times, but a well-rounded selection of plaintiffs on the defense drowned out their opinion. The psychology of both sides of the arguments for and against gun use and laws played a significant role in the ruling of the case. The main argument of the defendant for getting his permit was self-defense. Fear often motivates people to buy guns. Things like mass shootings, terrorism, and racism spark the idea that people need to protect themselves. The majority of people cite self-defense as the number one need for owning a gun, followed by hunting. In the Senate Judiciary Committee testimony by Lawrence Tribe, he discussed this in regards to the Heller decision by writing, "The district had in place one of the most restrictive firearms regulations in the nation. It essentially outlawed possession of handguns in the home, where the need for self-defense is, as Justice Scalia wrote, most acute. This shows how conservative political leaders justified the keeping of guns in the home for self-defense." On the other side, historically displaced minority groups like African Americans associate their acquiring of guns as self-defense from fear of racist police officers. As you can see, different types of people often have a perceived notion that they are under attack by something that they fear, and that guns are the solution to their fear. In this case, Heller was a special police officer that believed his life was in danger because of the career path that he chose. But the reality is that the majority of gun owners are more motivated in the symbolic value of owning a gun when purchasing one, rather than the practical value of owning a gun. They don't think about the practicalities of owning one, like keeping it safe from children or how to avoid accidents. This is why people with guns in their homes are more likely to be injured by guns. Oftentimes, the motivator for bringing up psychology into debate is only when violent crimes are committed. For example, mental illness is often the blame for gun violence rather than guns, especially from conservative politicians, claiming that there could be no rational way that the tool used for murder could actually be the cause for murder. As a result of this case, the definition of the Second Amendment was reinterpreted. The right to bear arms became an individual right, no longer sparking confusion to cases as a result of an idea needing to be associated with a militia to legally own a gun in certain places. Heller was granted his permit to keep a handgun in his home, and the case set the course for multiple other court cases that leaned in favor of a conservative ruling based upon the arguments used in D.C. vs. Heller. This has allowed gun rights to expand across the U.S., further fueling gun violence as a result. This is described in Alan Rostrand's testimony about the effectiveness of the U.S. government's gun policy around 2008 when he says, "The Department of Justice estimates that each year in America about 500,000 victims of violent crimes will face an offender armed with a gun. This shows at least 500,000 people face gun violence every year, which is an incredibly large amount of people." This case was such a turning point in gun use and gun laws because rather than taking action against the abuse of guns by inexperienced owners, or at least taking action to limit people with mental illnesses access to guns, the government promoted the use of more guns by encouraging more handgun permits to be granted. It set the tone for other cases regarding gun permits and gun laws as well. Since the court ruling, there have been dozens of mass shootings, which some argue could have been avoided if the case had set in place more gun restrictions and not allowed Heller to get his permit. Overall, this case was a significant change and marked a turning point in gun laws and use because geographical differences in uses of firearms were alike encouraged, conservative court rulings gained momentum, and psychological reasons like self-defense were accepted into the Supreme Court.
Just a big dog, yeah. My killer came in a bag.